On what you just said, because you talk about this in your book. Let me frame it this way: you said if Jews were that bad, what if we say if anti-Semitism was as bad as the Jewish community has held it to be, would the Jewish community have survived? And I guess you bring that up in your book about.
And exactly. The word, by the way, is the problem. What do we mean? It's a very modern word, and today it's used. This is something I address in this recent book more than I have maybe in other books. Today it's used very, very broadly. And I'm just reading a book on Lawrence of Arabia, and they talk about how many of the officers were anti-Semitic. Okay, that doesn't mean they're Hitlers. You know, they're also anti-Irish, and they're a fairly exclusive type of people, and so on. So, anti-Semitic has to mean something a little stronger than that. If you just say that if people don't like each other or feel cultural difference from one another, that's anti-Semitism, then everybody, and Jews certainly included, have such negative feelings about their neighbors. My colleague at the University of Illinois at Chicago, Richard Levy, insists on a pretty strong, I don't go as far as he does, but it has to be associated with violent action against Jews. Not just opinions about them, not just feelings about them, but linked to an ideology that said they must be destroyed. And that's a useful distinction. You know, the problems with it I discuss in this art. I wrote the introduction and an opening chapter to the book. I think there are problems with that definition too, making it a little too strong. But anti-Semitism is used, well, Ian Baruma, you may know, said this is a whistle that's been blown way too much. It doesn't mean the things that Hitler meant by it. So yeah, I think that is a problem. People don't particularly like Jews. People don't want to live with Jews. All right, those two things right there describe most Jews in their attitude to Gentiles. They don't like them. They don't want to live with them. And they want their own separate entity, but they're not saying they should be all murdered. Or even that they should be driven out. You know, that's an action too, is drive them from our midst. You know, Pharaoh didn't say he was going to kill them all. He enslaved them at one point, and then first he said you could go, and then he began to drive them out. You know the narrative, but that he's not going to murder them all. Murdering 2 million of them probably was more than he couldn't have accomplished. The number is really a problem. I don't know what to make of that number.
Could I ask you? There are really entrenched narratives about anti-Semitism and the Holocaust and Israel. And in my view, at least these are my subjects, and there's a lot of overlap and all that. Do you have any understanding or speculation, perspectives on that, which is to say, you're in your field and you got hit hard, and Mearsheimer, those guys are in their field, and the Holocaust, not to go far as Holocaust deniers, but anybody over in that realm, they're going to get hammered if you go past if you question dogma.
Yeah.
Do you land with?
I think that is true. It's true in many, not just the Jewish community. There are certain places you can't go. By the way, in the black community for a long time, anybody who, for instance, say after the Civil War, black criminality was a problem. It clearly was. But to say that was, you got yourself in big trouble. Just really, you'd be called a racist. I could go for every group, the relations with men and women and so on. There are things that can't be said, yet most of us think, yeah, there's probably some truth to it. So, yeah, it's there. I'm not quite sure what you want me to say beyond that, or what you're asking beyond that.
Well, is there a relationship between the three in terms of the kind of anti-Semitism of the Holocaust in Israel, in terms of the kind of the gatekeeping about information or discourse about this?
I think it's there. Yeah, I do. Now, by the way, Jews in the United States, just the 2% or so, are probably among the most liberal-minded group of such that you could identify, compared, let's say, to, I don't know, Puerto Ricans and Irish and so on. Liberalism has been good for the Jews, and I think most Jews are liberal in the fuller sense, not just politically liberal, but believe in the free work of ideas and so on. And even people like ADL leaders who I don't think, believe that quite so much, they will spout it. That they'll. Now there are limits, too, and we all recognize that you can't say let's murder, in an open, encouraging violence, shouting fire in a crowded theater and so on. There have to be limits, and that's a kind of real debate there. What are the real limits? In the United States, by the way, we tend to be much more willing to let those limits be pretty wide. In Germany, and to a lesser degree in France and Britain, you can be put in jail. You can actually be arrested and thrown in jail for years by saying the Holocaust didn't happen. Now, to me, that's really not right, because people say all kinds of stupid things. And Mars, you could think of all, there are Martians out there, the abominable snowman. People believe lots of things like that. And I think the remedy to it is simply to disprove it in a free society. To put them in jail, I don't think it's a good idea. Not that I like them very much, not that I respect what they had to say particularly, but it just is not. By the way, I think most Jews kind of believe that, even a lot of spokesmen. But it's getting very close to that point where they, what do we do against that? Now, years ago, anybody who would, say, defend the PLO, which I think needed some defense and had some points, was put into that category of Holocaust denier. You're beyond the pale. We're going to make sure you lose your job, or, so yeah. But I would emphasize that there is a problem. There's a real problem of where you draw the line, and it gets very, very subtle. Are the things you're saying encouraging others? Gun control is another, good example of that. Where do you actually draw the line?
Well, that comes up for your work, doesn't it? The idea that your work is solace for anti-Semites, or it's a tool
Sure.
for them and all.
Sure.
I talked to Finkelstein about this too, because he gets the same kind of thing.
Yeah.
Could you discuss that?
Well, you can say that, of course.
What's your responsibility? Where as a scholar, where do you draw lines about this?
My responsibility is to try to say what I think is actually true, and not play the game of how's this going to go down. But it is an issue. Teaching undergraduates, I've done that for 50 years. How they misinterpret things you say. About the First World War or the French Revolution, they get it all messed up. And should I stop teaching all those things? I just try to give them my best. And by the way, the more subtle the point you make, the more likely people like undergraduates will get it all screwed up and make it so much more simple. So if you say something subtle, or at least textured, that an anti-Semite will take and give it a new meaning, that's just going to have to be the case. What's the alternative? That you just don't even try because somebody can misuse? That's clearly, that's a very, very unattractive direction. It's contrary to almost all scholarship. And as you probably know, I'm sure you know, almost all of what we now consider the great insights of science have been bitterly opposed from Galileo to Darwin, so on. So should they also not say the thing they said because it will destroy religion or make people immoral or whatever?
Well, do you consider yourself a pioneer in any regard in this field?
That is a really big question.
Qualify it. Again, I'm not an expert, but I've looked at a few things and whatever, and I don't see anything. And you're not Jewish, also. I don't see anything else comparable to my knowledge of what you've done with that book. What does that mean? Is my question.
Anyone who wants to take a term like that and say I am, I've been recognized by people like William Rubenstein as a pioneer. I'm not sure that would be the word I'd like to. Someone who's opened the debate, I think, who's kind of opened the debate a bit. By the way, I have also plenty of nasty right-winger types have praised the book, as well as people on the left. They come from all kinds of communities. So, in a way, I think what to me is the most significant sign that some of the, quote, respected scholars have reviewed the book and completely misinterpreted. I mean, I think a couple of them I could sue. I've been told by, they just totally misrepresent what I put in the book. And you know, I've never sued anybody, been sued, and so I'm not even thinking about that.
In a book review,
yeah.
In the review, they slandered you or smeared you or
Oh
something?
yes, yes. And respectable books too. I mean, people consider respectable. I mean, slandered in the sense they said that I said things in the book that simply aren't there. Now that happens in reviews all the time. If you ever read New York Review books or the Times Literary Supplement, you'll get the letters to the editor, did this reviewer read my book, and so on. So I'm not going to say it's unheard of. Of course, it's many times been the case. But gee, one of them I sat down and I stopped counting at 30 factual, you know, things you could just say, look in the book, it doesn't say that. But that hasn't been the major tone, I have to say, by the way. I've gotten a lot of very favorable reviews by Jews, by non-Jews as well. Some in the middle and some very hostile, which almost any book you could say that about. You know. If you get all hostile, then you don't feel so good, or you may be really a pioneer. If you get all beneficial, then you have to wonder if this guy hasn't got saying something that, you know, is just pablum.
But may I ask again, the fact that you're not Jewish then, and you've kind of entered, you've opened a door that hasn't been opened very much or at all. I don't know. But what does that say then about the kind of issues at stake in terms of the Jewish community and
yeah.
the scholarship in the Jewish community?
Yeah. I think the problem there is the Jewish community, because it is a very big house. And there isn't a line that all Jews follow by any means. There is, nonetheless, there are individuals who try to keep the debate limited. I can't say they're the Jewish community. They're particular influential Jews, are Jews who really don't like certain things to be said. But I wouldn't say the Jewish community. That's a very, you know, the Jewish community is a very problematic concept. On the one hand, it exists, but trying to say what its actual borders are is very difficult.
This subject comes up all the time, but with Mearsheimer and Walt, the issue of the Israel lobby. I mean, it's the same terrain, exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
What were you talking about?
I think in that sense, it's a lot nastier. That is, the defense of Israel has been the cruder, the demonization of the Arabs cruder. And by the way, I'm no particular defender of them, because they're like almost all human groups. They've done terrible things. You know, these things, I could go on. Again, I've written on this before. If you just look at how the debate has run since the 50s, and the things said in defense of Israel, that just weren't true. About what the battle was like, and the war was like, whether or not Arabs had settled there, these things that I think that is probably a lot cruder. Now it's all coming out, and the new historians in Israel have begun to open up those doors too. So anyway, I think the point could be best made right there in discussing Israel. I mean, the novel and movie Exodus is nonsense. It's just really awful. It's terribly written. Yet it's a tremendous bestseller, made into a blockbuster movie, and millions of young people, I've run across them, all think this is the truth about Israel. And the Arabs in it are terrible caricatures, but also the Jews are terrible caricatures in the other way. Yet it's considered one of the great statements about Israel. Well, that's saying something.
In the whole paradigm of this Israel lobby business, I'm over there, but doesn't your work fit into the paradigm in the sense that if you start to undergird the kind of Jewish innocence thing, which is it feeds the Holocaust, and the Holocaust feeds Israel. I mean, do you have any sense of that in terms of your own work? You understand?
I'm not quite sure I understand what you...
Part of what I'm discussing with people, I'm finding with people, is that the justifications for Israel and what it does and all that is in large part based on the Holocaust, and thereby anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
So your work falls within the parameters of all this.
Yeah, by the way, I hope you don't... I could easily be seen from what I said before as simplifying the Arab-Israeli conflict. I'd be the last one to try to simplify it. The way I stated it, when I composed the narrative about it, it is not a narrative of good guys and bad guys. It's a narrative of tragedy, of two claims, both of which you can feel sympathies for. I mean, the Jews, and I have often said, if I had lived in a position to be making decisions, I was just a kid, in 48, 49, I can't believe I would not have voted in favor of establishing a Jewish state and trying to help the Jewish refugees find a place, since they were being pushed from pillar to post and so on, and they'd experienced unspeakable horrors. Nobody wanted to take them. This was the way. I'm not sure I believe all that exactly, but they deserved some sympathy. Now, I don't want to make them villains, but on the other hand, what they did, especially as they got power, the relations they had with the Arabs. Now, of course, the Arabs are not about to accept any Jews there, or they didn't want very many of them. And again, how many Americans or Californians would accept, let's say the Japanese made a claim to our land and came and pushed us out of our houses and said, we deserve this. Even if they did deserve it, you were not going to be very happy about it. Now that, framing the narrative as a tragedy is very important. And then the next thing you ask is, what do you do about it? Now, again, I don't want to give a whole lecture on this, but if there's anything to be done, and I'm inclined to think not, that it's just going to end when they've killed each other in tremendous numbers. And I see that building now on both sides. It's, I'm not a very optimistic, but anyway, trying to undo to some degree the terrible injustice done to them, which would mean really countries like the United States and Germany put billions of dollars into that area to rebuild homes for them, help them get started and so on. And I'm not sure even that will work, because it's a terrible, terrible scar in their memory, the Nakba, as they call it, the catastrophe.
Well, again, is your book, can you conceive it as a threat to the Jewish the Jewish narrative about
yeah, exactly, it is.
Could you elaborate on that?
Well, I think it makes it more ambiguous. It makes it much more difficult. If you think that the Arabs are just nasty people, they really don't deserve much of our sympathy, and that you can do whatever you want to them, which comes down to the narrative of many of the people who defended Israel at that point. Fine. But if you then begin to say, well, what we did wasn't really all that moral, it wasn't all that good, it wasn't all that fair, it was nasty. Now the world is nasty. By the way, many people define Israel in that way, and I think that makes a lot of sense. If anybody in the world had a right to be nasty and play hardball, it was the Jews in 48, 49. Because nobody was giving them much sympathy. All right, that's true. But if you push that very far, then the only solution in Israel now is more force. And it doesn't look good for the Jews in that regard. They're outnumbered like 50 to 1. And all this change now that's occurring, God knows where that's going to go. People have atomic weapons in that area, and it's just, it doesn't look good.
Okay, back to your work, please. When I interviewed Professor Mearsheimer, he told me, and also Professor Watt, he told me one of the reasons that he had to co-author each other, they both said it, was that they knew what they were facing, and they knew there was going to be a firestorm, and one individual could not withstand that firestorm. Now, you mentioned in your book about that people were counseling you that you're going to have some troubles. Could you elaborate on that? Do you have hesitation? Did you know what you were getting into? In terms of the most extreme...
Yeah, but I have not faced with Walt and Mearsheimer, for sure. And they have taken it much more to the public and written op-ed pieces time after. I've done a few of those, but not a lot. So it is not comparable. But sure, I knew that would happen. What I had done before that was oppose the war in Vietnam. Now, opposing the war in Vietnam was not pretty, I'll tell you. I got spit on, I got kicked out, I got, police followed me, and it was a hard time. Now, I didn't do it because I wanted those things to happen. I did it because I thought it was a terrible war. So my own position about writing books that I write, I know it's going to make some people angry. I've never had death threats, but I've certainly had lots of nasty things said. But I think it's the right thing to do. And sometimes, by the way, I might be wrong on some things. Undoubtedly am. I hope not in the whole schmear, but on details. When you go through a complicated history like that, you can get some things wrong.
Back to the book, could you discuss, please, synopsize, what exactly does your title refer to, Esau's Tears?
Yeah. The classic story, this is another narrative. Esau and Jacob are born twins, fighting in the womb. So you could almost say this is a God-given reality. Esau, the archetypal Gentile, Jacob, the father of all Jews, are already in the womb struggling with each other. But probably more, the effect is that Jacob and his mother trick Esau. And I'm not sure if you'll go through the whole narrative, but Esau, he had a legitimate gripe. He was stupid also. He did things he shouldn't have done. I mean, he shouldn't. Now, it's a very primitive narrative, by the way, and it's been endlessly analyzed. But Esau's tears refers to the tears of indignation when he finds out he'd been tricked. Now, many Jews object to that very much. They don't want that narrative to be seen in that way. But it's like the other narratives I referred to. It's very kind of blank. So if you look at it, you can say, an anti-Semite must have written this. And it caused, the people, the Talmudic interpreters had to really scramble to make Esau the bad guy and Jacob the good guy. Because on the one hand, Jacob seems like a scoundrel, a scheming scoundrel, trying to get his father's blessings on him and not on Esau.
So that's clear. How does this inform anti-Semitism? And I mean, I guess the way the anti-Semites say, I'm thrown for a loop by how the Jewish community does claim Jacob, But
Yeah.
So how does the anti-Semites then take that story and use it for their purposes to understand history?
By the way, I don't think a great many anti-Semites do that today, for instance. You get to a kind of a really different kind of question. I'll give you another example. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. I have never met a student, ever, who's read it. It's supposed to be one of the most influential documents around. Now, apparently in the Middle East, it's being read more widely and spread. But moreover, it's inherently stupid. It's inherently ridiculous. But okay. What does it make some people feel that this is really a true story? And by the way, many anti-Semites don't even believe it's a true story, but they say it could be true. It's like what you expected, all right. Get to a fundamental thing about my interpretation of anti-Semitism. It isn't really so much about facts as is about mentalities. People who have a need to hate, who have a need to find simple explanations to vent that hatred, are big candidates for anti-Semitism. And they'll find the facts that they want. Now, they don't necessarily have to just manufacture them out of whole cloth or make up fantasies, because there are some facts there they can build on. Now, like I said, I don't believe persuasive. I mean, it didn't convert me into an anti-Semite to see these things. But to say that Jews have nothing to do with it, that it's entirely a construction of the corrupt Gentile mind, seems to me too clearly apologetic. We didn't do nothing, and they did it all. It's very much more complicated than that. But you reckon my point there is that I am granting this. It is something about the predisposition of the mind, of the way facts are processed, that's most important, not so much the facts themselves. The person who is totally objective doesn't exist. I'm not one of them, certainly. We all filter facts in various ways, and our emotions play on how we do that. That isn't to say we can't engage in exchanges about who's doing the best job of it, or point out to somebody else that your argument doesn't make a lot of sense, that this argument is better, and so that's the nature of the intellectual world.
Is it fair to say, and I've heard this in different ways, that, and you can say this about anybody I recognize, but is a large part of Jewish scholarship biased about a lot of these issues?
No, I don't think so. I think there are popular books. That's the question. You're talking about Exodus, the book by Leon Uris, which I think is just trash. And it probably has 1,000 readers. For one reader of Jacob Katz, who's really one of the kind of real innovators and interesting. So it's a qualitative thing to a degree. I don't think most Jewish scholarship, and by the way, most of what I've learned is by reading Jewish scholarship. It's been turned against me. Well, Lindemann doesn't read Hebrew. I do actually read Yiddish and the classic texts and so on, therefore he can't. Now, by that argument, no one can ever make an evaluation against Jews unless they can read Hebrew. It's kind of ridiculous. And anybody who wants to do what I did, that is try to put it together in a larger package, in a comparative perspective, cannot possibly read. I mean, I read 7 languages, but it's nothing compared to how many I need to read. And reading the languages, I don't think the ultimate thing. I think it's a sign that I've tried to branch out. I've tried to become as broad as possible, try to become as familiar with as many nationals, traditions as I can, and put it all together. By the way, and that's, if I'm a pioneer, it's that effort to pull it all together in not just anti-Semitism among the French or the German, but a larger picture. Not, by the way, that's been done before. Maybe I just think I did. Maybe do it a little more, not better, but more recently.
What perspective do you have on the term Jewish self-hatred? And I've interviewed Sander Gilman, who wrote a book on it,
Yeah.
Finkelstein, all those. I interviewed Noam Chomsky, who's one of the original quote Jewish self-haters, so-called. What's your take on that term?
I don't like the term. I think it's a facile term used by many Jews to describe somebody who says something they don't like. That it exists is also clear. I would say a little bit of self-hatred is probably a healthy thing. As an American, there are things my country's done and traits my countrymen have that I don't particularly like. As a Californian, and I could go on. Does that make me somehow a bad person? I think being critical of yourself. Now, when it goes to the point, this is the famous, what's his name? Hitler said of this particular Jewish character who wrote a book on Jewish self-hatred.
Lessing?
No, it's right in the turn of the century. I can't even think of it. Anyway, he's the only Jew he liked. He wrote a book on self-hatred and committed suicide. Well, okay, that's Bobby Fischer. You're probably a better example. You know who I'm talking about? This new biography of his. The guy clearly hates Jews, and he himself is Jewish. His mother is Jewish. Whether he was brought up as a Jew is another question. What that means, but there it is really venomous. He's a tremendously anti-American too. So I mean, it exists, no question about it. But I think the term is way overused, like anti-Semite.
Could you discuss some? I have some quotes here later. If we get to them, you make the point that you can't generalize about anti-Semites. There have been so many kinds from all persuasions. Could you elaborate on that?
Well, you certainly can. You can generalize. I'm saying you shouldn't do it in a very loose way. I'm saying anybody who simply says, "I prefer not to live among Jews," or "I don't find Groucho Marx funny," or something of that sort, I don't think you just say somebody who's not comfortable with Jews. But by the way, that isn't the way. The term means just about any. I mean, I have people tell me examples of kids say, "Well, Jews are good businessmen." That's anti-Semitic. Well, come on, Jews are good businessmen. Jews are good chess players. Well, about 60% or 70% of the chess players, the masters of the world, have been Jews, and they're less than 1/10 of 1% of the population. There are truths about Jews that you can say, that you can maybe say are also partly anti-Semitic, that is hostile. But until it gets to another dimension, I say when you really are talking about using that hostile view as an ideology that justifies doing harm to Jews. Basically tolerance We all love tolerance. What does toleration mean? It means people do things you don't like, and you just live with it. You know, tolerance. If we didn't have tolerance, we wouldn't have marriage. We wouldn't have, wouldn't have families. So people do have to tolerate one another, the differences they have. To call tolerance anti-Semitism, I mean, the lack, in other words, until you have that, until you recognize we all have those little things that we just, okay, you say that, I don't like that, but if you're going to make that anti-Semitism, it's madness.
I've run across this a lot, this kind of thing. I mean, you said something like, Jews are good businessmen or something, and there's a worldview out there, and it comes, so someone's going to step forward and say, you can't say that. There's always an exception. It's about generalizations.
Yeah.
It's about stereotyping. It's about Jews.
That's what I was saying. Generalizations. That's.
Well, how do you handle it? Because you have to.
I don't make no generalizations. Except that one. Are all generalizations are false, except that one. I mean, this has been played with by, generalizations are what we live by. That's a generalization. It's inconceivable to have coherent speech between people without generalizations. Our language is itself based upon generalizations of ideal types of things and so on. The problem is with the value of the issue is the value of the generalization. If I say, I don't know, you can think of all kinds of generalizations that are stupid, that just don't work, but many of them are useful. And sometimes you're talking about something that's very close to, it's 50-50. And that's, by the way, that's where the interesting debate has to occur. If the issue is really that 90% of the people will recognize it completely false, it's not that useful. I mean, I shouldn't say not that interesting. It becomes interesting. The Arab-Israeli conflict is a good example. That's an interesting subject because it's so difficult to answer. There's so many rights and wrongs on both sides. And I think people who are honest intellectually and to really have, in a sense, dispassionate, I want to find the truth, can debate about that. But that doesn't describe a large part of the population. So anyway, generalizations. It's something we all talk about. When in American, European history, we're talking about generalizations. What are Americans like? What are Frenchmen like? When I lived in Italy for a while, now this is maybe getting off the subject, but I made some pretty negative generalizations about Italians and women. I have a beautiful wife, and I couldn't walk down the street unless I was arm in arm without these guys just doing all kinds of things. Now, by the way, I love the Italians. We lived there, and I just enjoy this, but that part I didn't like too much. And when I came to France, I'd lived in France before, we crossed the border. It's like somebody, just a magic wand. You stop getting all these cat calls, and these guys in Italy would jump up and try to kiss my wife in the cheek and all kinds of an English woman there said, when I'm in Italy, I feel like a bitch in heat. All right, that's a generalization. You go to Italy and deny it. I mean, even today, and it's not nearly as bad now as it was when I was there in the 70s. Okay, they're generalizations. I think it's a negative generalization about Italians in that particular thing. Not all Italians do it, probably not most Italians, but there's a subset out there that wins a particular prize, I guess, for the Italian people. Irish don't drink. How many people would say that? Irish are drinkers. Now, was it all Irish drink? No. I mean, you see my point, I hope, that, of course, that's in the nature of debate and understanding. When you describe a country, you've got to make generalizations about it. I'm writing a textbook now where I want my students to be able to understand the difference between Germans and French and Italians and English, and I got to make generalizations about them. They're kind of like great big circles, I'd say, that overlap one another, And on the outside are things that don't hold, but lots of them do hold.
Okay, could you discuss the dual morality? I think you talked about that somewhat between traditional Jewish in-groups and out-groups historically, and the issues about that. Am I making myself clear?
Well, yeah, sure. The dual, that's a charge made that Jews have a dual morality. That's an anti-Semitic charge, that there's one thing for Jews and one thing for... Now, by the way, that's a charge made about Italians and Irish and so on, that for the inside group. I mean, it's so common in the world. You know, in Africa, I'm told, if you treat other people, and say in Kenya, outside your tribe in an equal way, that's considered immoral. You've got to have a dual morality. That is, you've got a morality for the outsider, a morality for your kinsmen. That's so common in human history. All right, the modern world, and especially the Anglo-Saxon, Northern European, has a sense, well, citizens are all equal, and we should treat them equally in that particular public sphere. But the assertion continually is, well, Jews don't do that as much as other people. So is there some truth to it? I think obviously there is. There's some truth to it in application to every other group. The Jews themselves have been very successful in some areas like movies, finance, and so on. And you can tell they never, what's the word, do something to help their cousin or something like that. Of course they do. Everybody does to a degree. And whether it's worse among the Jews than other people, I really don't know how you'd measure that. But it's there, and it's human. Madoff's wife believes that all of that happened was the fault of the Gentiles. Okay, I guess the Gentiles put him up to it. The Gentiles. This is just a quotation I heard. You know.
So there's an implicit anti-Semitism charge in that? I mean, I haven't heard that.
Oh yeah. That, by the way, is I would use that gingerly because I'm sure it's the kind of things you read in the paper.
Okay.
You know, I want to see whether she actually said that and would stand by it.
Okay, may I